I'm certainly glad that you're here this morning, and I hope you've got your Bibles with you and you're prepared to use them as we study together. If you have time this afternoon, read through Daniel chapter 3. I debated as to whether to cover Daniel 3 as we talk about Daniel and how he was a man a man treasured by God. But then it occurred to me that our friends tell us a great deal about who we are. And so when we look at the friends of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we learn something about faith, but also they're a reflection of Daniel's character. And so we're going to talk a little bit about them and their faith in the midst of the fiery furnace in our study tonight. You know, there are some struggles that we face that are not shared by everyone, I should say. They're not that they're unique to us, but that not everybody shares. For example, not everybody may struggle with having drank or done drugs. Not everybody will be guilty of adultery or stealing. Not everybody deals with unfaithful children. And so there may be things that I struggle with that you say, I don't have a problem with that. Or there may be things that you struggle with that maybe I can't easily relate to because for me they're not a struggle. But there is one area that I think we'd all admit at least that we all struggle with, and that is the struggle with the tongue. If I was to ask for a show of hands this morning of all those that have never sinned with the tongue, how many of you would be bold enough to raise your hand and say, you know what, I've never said anything I shouldn't. I've never said something in the wrong way. My tongue is tamed and it's mastered. Surely none of us would be so bold as to claim that. In fact, James chapter 3 and in verse 2, James made the point as he began that great section on the tongue that we all stumble in many things, but if any man does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. So we all sin in many areas, but the hardest part of man to learn to master is that of the tongue. And so I want to talk with you in a general way about the tongue this morning, but as the beginning sort of a series of lessons where I hope to sort of interweave sins of the tongue with some positive uses of the tongue and how we can use it in the right way. But as we begin to talk about the tongue this morning, I think it's important to understand that the tongue is neither inherently good or bad. That is, it has the potential for both. Sometimes if we say, well, we're going to be talking about the tongue, probably immediately we think, okay, now here's a list of things that we're going to hear that we shouldn't be doing with our tongue, and we almost always think of it in a negative way. But the reality is the tongue can be a very good thing, and it has the potential to do things that are very valuable. For example, in the book of Proverbs chapter 15 and in verse 4, the proverb writer said, a wholesome tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness breaks the spirit. That is, a gentle tongue can impart life and do value for others. In the book of Proverbs chapter 16 and in verse 24, pleasant words are like honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the bones. Just like a honeycomb is sweet. When somebody says pleasant words to us, it's sweet to us and it's valuable. And it can impart healing, and it can impart life. There's probably no doubt in your mind, if you think back, you can think of something good that somebody said to you to encourage you that really made all the difference in your life. In the book of Proverbs chapter 15 and in verse 23, a word spoken in due season, how good it is. That is to say the right thing at the right time in the right way. It is absolutely invaluable. Proverbs 25 and verse 11 said, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and pictures of silver. Proverbs like that could be enumerated that tells me that the tongue has the potential to be very valuable and can be used in a way that it helps and it encourages other people. But while the tongue can be good, the tongue also has the potential to be really bad. And we can be guilty of many sins with the tongue. I tell you what the tongue can do. The tongue has the potential to ruin friendships. A whisper can separate the best of friends. Have you ever known, I've dealt sometimes, unfortunately, in the body of Christ with individuals that were once just best friends. I mean, they would have given each other life for one another. And somewhere along the line, something was said, and now that friendship has been ruined. Maybe by them, maybe by somebody else, but it has the potential to ruin friendships. The tongue can cause death. Proverbs chapter 18. And in verse 21, the proverb writer said, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. It has the potential to make a bad situation worse. A soft answer can turn away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. We've probably all been there, unfortunately, where we were in a disagreement and somebody stirs it up by angry words, and sometimes we just decide we're going to add more fuel to the fire, and it makes a bad situation even worse. And of course, it can cause hurt. In Proverbs 18 and verse 8, talks about the whisperer or the talebearer. They're tasty trifles that seems to indicate we all like to hear it, despite our protest otherwise. But they go down into the inmost body. That seems to indicate that while they're tasty trifles, they can be painful, and it hurts and it destroys other people. And so the tongue is neither inherently good nor is it inherently bad. It has the potential to be either one, depending upon how we control it. And I think we'd admit that directing it in the positive way and away from the negative use can be challenging. And I think there are a number of reasons that it's a challenge to keep the tongue under control. Let me just say and emphasize again, it is a universal challenge. I've probably said this before, but I remember several years ago in another place I announced we're going to have a series of lessons, I think it was in Bible classes, on the home, being a good husband, being a good wife. And there was a lady that was attending there. She was in her 60s. She had never been married. Both of her parents were her mom had died, her dad was aged, and she said, you know what, I find this to be of absolutely no value to me. I'm not a wife, I'm never going to be a wife. I don't have a husband. By this time I've come to the conclusion I'm not going to have a husband. That's not of value to me. And I think we all hear lessons preached that we say, you know what, that's not something I need right now. If I was to do a series of lessons on raising children, some of you would say, you know what, that ship has sailed. You know, I've already raised them. Maybe I can hear something to help children or grandchildren, but in terms of application to my life right now, that's not something I'm doing. But you know, when I talk about the tongue, it's something that all of us can use. It can be a struggle for older men. In Titus chapter 2 and in verse 2, older men were told to be sober, reverent, temperate, that is self-controlled, sound in faith and love and in patience. And I think we'd admit that self-controlled, at least in part, would deal with the tongue. Older women were specifically told not to be slanderers, not to be given to much wine, teachers of good things, and admonish the young women. At least 3 of those things have to do with the tongue. In a negative way, not being a slanderer. In a positive way, being a teacher and an admonisher. Then young men are told a little bit later on in this same chapter, in verses 7 and verse 8, that they need to have sound speech that cannot be condemned. And then the younger women, in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 11, the younger widows in particular, they were told to get busy and to get married and have children so they wouldn't be gossips and busybodies in other people's matters. What I learned when I go through that is it's a challenge that's universal. I'm confident that no matter how old I live, if I live to be 100 years old, I'm still going to have to be careful about keeping a bridle on my tongue. It's not a problem exclusive to the young or the old or to men or to women, but rather it is a universal challenge. And it's universal and it's a challenge because the tongue is never tamed. In the book of James, chapter 3 and 7 and 8, the Bible makes this observation that every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. You look at just about any kind of creature. You go down to SeaWorld, and you've seen before where they can take the great creatures of the sea and they can train them to put on a show. There's not an animal that man has not brought under control, it seems, in some way. But the very next verse said, but the tongue no man can tame. You know who that no man is? That's me and that's you. Now, I would emphasize that tame, I don't think means controlled. James is not saying that we cannot control the tongue. In fact, bridling suggests that we have to bring it under control. In fact, if I can't control the tongue, then ultimately that would mean I can't control whether or not I'm saved or lost. If by my words I'm justified and by my words I'm condemned, if I have no control over it and I can't control it, then that would mean ultimately I can't control whether or not I'm saved or lost. I don't think James is saying that I can't control the tongue, but I believe what he's saying is that the tongue is never so completely mastered that we don't have to keep an eye on it. He's not so completely tamed. You ever gone in someone's house? I remember when our kids were little, maybe in a meeting or something, you go into a house and maybe somebody has a dog, and they would say, you know what, we watch him when he's around kids. In other words, we've got him, he listens, but we don't trust him so much that we don't want to keep an eye on him. The tongue is like that. The tongue is never so completely mastered that I say, you know what, I don't have to think. I don't have to keep a bridle on it. It seems just like the moment we think we're doing well, then we slip up again because we didn't have that bridle. I tell you, the other challenge is about taming the tongue is just because we can control the tongue in one area doesn't mean we've mastered it in another area. And what I mean by that is we might be completely honest and we would never think about lying, but we may struggle with gossip. And it may be the person that struggles with gossip or may not struggle with gossip, but they take the Lord's name in vain. And the person that just bristles at gossip and would never think about being dishonest, they're always saying things in anger. Do you see the problem with the tongue is that there's so much to master that I may have been able to master even one area, and yet I may struggle with yet another area of the tongue. And so it's a challenge. Why? Because it's universal. Because the tongue can never be tamed, and the challenge is how important it is. You know, there are some things in life that people just try to sort of dismiss. I've heard people with a tongue, maybe there's somebody that I just say it as it is. You know what, that's just how I am. That's how I'm made. And we sort of justify things. But the reality is, my salvation depends on me controlling the tongue. It's not a matter of, that's just how I am. I just tell it how it is, and I don't care who it hurts, and I don't care how it affects other people. It's not something that should be easily dismissed because my salvation depends upon me controlling the tongue. How do I know that? Well, I know that because in Proverbs chapter 13 and in verse 3, the proverb writer tells me that it's necessary to preserve life. He who guards his mouth preserves his life, but he opens wide his lips shall have destruction. If I can't keep it closed, sometimes I'm going to lead to destruction. In fact, it doesn't matter what else I do. I can be the best teacher of the gospel, preacher. I can attend every service. I can be benevolent and helping other people in the time of need. And if I don't bridle my tongue, you know what the Lord said about all of that? All of that other stuff is what? It's vain. It's useless. It is of absolutely no value. And so if I'm going to be saved, I'm going to have to learn to control the tongue. In fact, what Jesus said in Matthew 12, 35 and 37 is that we're going to give an account for every idle word. Which of my words am I going to have to give an account for before God? You know what the Lord said? For every idle or careless word. I take that to be even those words that we say flippantly without thinking. God says you're going to be accountable for that. For by your words you'll be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. It would be sad. Wouldn't it be sad for you to get to the Lord in the day of judgment and stand before Him, or for me to stand before Him and say, Mike, I realize all that you did, but here's the problem. You didn't bridle your tongue, and you're going to be condemned because of the use that you made of it. Is that a possibility? Could that happen? It can happen to us in the end. By our words we're justified, and by our words we'll be condemned. And so it's important to see in the fact that we can that our salvation depends on it, and because the tongue is a member that can be guilty of sin. I'm not going to go through all of these passages here, But we do realize that we can sin with the tongue. Psalm chapter 34 and verse 13, we need to keep the tongue from evil, the Bible says, and your lips from speaking guile. Psalm 39 and verse 1, I will guard my ways lest I sin with the tongue. Job didn't sin with his tongue, which would imply that that is a possibility. And of course, the challenge is that it takes maturity to learn to bridle the tongue. The last thing that we really learn to master, I think, in life is probably our tongue. I've illustrated it this way before. I've seen problems happen in churches. I've seen division in churches. I've seen divisions in home. And I don't know that I've ever had anybody come and sit down and say, you know what, that business meeting went terrible. You know why? Brother Brown went over and slugged. Now, I've heard business meetings where that happened. I've never been part of one. That is, we have enough control over ourselves that we don't lash out with our hands, do we? We have enough control over ourselves that oftentimes physically we don't respond, but how often do problems begin because of something somebody said? And that tells me that it takes maturity. In fact, anybody that has learned to bridle the tongue, he is a perfect man. That doesn't mean he's sinless, and it doesn't mean that he never sins with the tongue, but it means he's obtained some level of maturity in order to be able to do that. And so the challenge is that when we are immature is really when we're struggling with the tongue, and it takes some maturity to learn how to control it. And so the challenge is seen in the fact that it's universal. It's never tame. My salvation depends on it because it takes maturity. And I think the challenge is also seen in what we have to learn to control. And that is that it's not just one thing. We have to learn to control what we say. That's one thing. So I have to learn to say the right thing. Ephesians, and it may be on your outline wrong. I think it's chapter 5 and verse 29, unless there's a blank there. It should be Ephesians 4 and verse 29, where it said, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification. If I understand what corrupt communication is, it is any communication that does harm, that is designed to hurt or inflict pain upon others. In other words, my purpose of the tongue is always to build up, never to tear down. Now, sometimes in building up, that may involve reproof, that may involve rebuke, but the goal of the tongue is always to build up and never to tear down. But here's the point. I've got to control what I say, right? That I don't let corrupt communication or bad things proceed out of my mouth. But not only do I have to learn to control what I say, I have to learn to control when we say what we say. Proverbs 25 and verse 11 said, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and pitchers of silver, our word spoken in due time. We've talked a little bit in the book of Job. Sometimes it's not what you say, sometimes it's the timing of what you say that is bad. So when I learn to control the tongue, sometimes I have to tell myself, not that. Sometimes I have to tell myself, not that right now. There may be a time to say that later on. There may be a time that we need to, but this is not the right time for that. Sort of like Zophar or Bildad telling Job that your sons are suffering because of their own sin. That wasn't right, number one, but even if it was right, that wasn't the time to say that. But not only do I have to learn to control what I say and learn to control when I say it, I've got to learn to control, by the way, here's some other translation. Everybody enjoys a fitting reply. It's wonderful to say the right thing at the right time. But not only do I have to learn to say the right thing at the right time, I've got to learn to say it in the right way. Sometimes our problem is not what we say, but how we say things. And that is that our speech has to be seasoned with salt, Colossians 4 and verse 6. Like Daniel, we talked about last week, who learned to control with tact, or answer with tact and discretion, or with wisdom. And so the challenge of controlling the tongue is really a challenge, because not only do I have to say, okay, here's what I should say. I should say this, but not that. Then I have to determine, is this the time to say it? And then after I determine if it's the time to say it, I've got to be sure that I'm saying it with the right attitude and the right tone. I tell you what, it can be a challenge sometimes, can it? And so you begin to understand why James would say it takes maturity to control the tongue. And finally, let me just say it's a challenge because of the power of the tongue. It's a small member, but it can do great damage. You know, there's nothing overly menacing about the tongue. If you look at it in the mirror, it doesn't look like it could do all that much damage, could it? It doesn't look like a menacing member of the body, and yet it's small and it can do great things. It's a world of iniquity, James called it in James 3:6. That tongue that you look at, it's a world of iniquity. Not only is it a world of iniquity, it can defile the whole body. It can affect everything that we are and everything that we do. It's an unruly evil, and it's full of deadly poison, and that means I've got to learn to control it. It's a challenge because of the power that it can do. And I tell you, part of the challenge, maybe I should have put on here, is that once it's used in the right way or in the wrong way, you can't take it back. You know, there are some things that in life you just can't undo. You ever lashed out to somebody in anger, and you can come back and you can say, "What, I shouldn't have said that," or "I'm sorry," but guess what? They still heard. The damage oftentimes is still done. And so I think it's important when we think about the tongue to realize that the tongue is neither inherently good or evil. It can be either one. It has to be directed in the right way and controlled in the right way. And that's a challenge. It is a real challenge for most of us, and it will be a challenge through our entire life. And so let's talk about some general principles about controlling the tongue. We'll say more specifically about areas like honesty or like blasphemy or like gossip and other areas and principles there. But let's think for a moment about some general principles that the Bible lays down about us controlling the tongue. Let me just say, first of all, when I think about a principle about controlling the tongue, if that's a struggle, is I need to identify the specific area of the tongue you are struggling with. In other words, it helps if I identify what I'm struggling with. You know, it would sort of be like if you went to the doctor and you said, "I don't feel well. I'm sick." Well, before the doctor can treat it, you know what he needs to do or she needs to do? They're going to have to figure what exactly is wrong with you. And only when they identify why you're feeling bad are they going to be able to treat that. In other words, with the tongue, it's so general that it helps if we can identify the specific area of the tongue that we are struggling with, because not all issues of the tongue are dealt with in the same way. For example, let me just illustrate that with a couple of things. When the Lord was talking to the younger widows about gossip, and he thought that the younger widows apparently had a propensity toward gossip. You know what his solution was? He said, you need to get married, you need to get busy, and if you're married and you're busy and you're taking care of kids, you're not going to have time, what? To gossip. And so that was a solution to, or at least one solution to the problem of gossip. The general principle there is not get married and have kids, but it's stay busy. Devote yourself to a worthwhile endeavor, and that means you don't have time to do some of these other things. But, you know, while that's helpful about gossip, staying busy may not do a whole lot about profanity, if that's where one is struggling with. Could one be busy and still profane? Or busy and still be guilty of flattery? So I need to identify maybe the specific area, and it may be more than one area of the tongue. What am I trying to overcome? Is it gossip? Am I overcoming words of anger? Is it profanity? Is it vulgarity? What exactly is the area of tongue I'm struggling with? And that will help me. Second thing I have to learn to do if I'm going to use the tongue is exercise some restraint in any area. That is, I don't have to say all that sometimes I want to say. Do you always tell everything you want to tell? If you do, you're not very wise. Because the Bible tells us in passages like Proverbs 10 and verse 19 that in the multitude of words sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise. What that means is they decide sometimes, here's something I want to say, and guess what? I'm not going to say it. In fact, Proverbs 27, and 28 said, he who has knowledge spares his words. He who has knowledge spares his words, and a man of understanding is of calm spirit. In other words, sometimes there is a time just not to speak. There are a number of proverbs I've got written in the margin of my electronic Bible There's an old proverb that's been attributed to a lot of different people. It's been attributed to Abraham Lincoln, to Mark Twain. Some have contributed it to an old Chinese proverb. But it says, better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and to remove all doubt. And there's some wisdom in that. There's an old German proverb that says, talking comes by nature, silence by understanding. In other words, sometimes the wise course is what? To be silent, to exercise some restraint, and that you don't have to say all that you want to say in every given situation. Furthermore, that restraint is brought about by always thinking before you speak. Or maybe I should put it this way, we need to think soberly. Sometimes we say, and this is never true, I said it before I thought. Now, that's never true, because before it comes off my tongue, it has to cross through my mind. That's an impossibility, because the Bible tells us that. The Bible tells us that it's out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. But what I really mean by that is sometimes I speak impulsively without thinking soberly about a situation. And so the Bible tells me I need to learn to think before I speak. The heart of the righteous studies how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours forth evil. Can I make this point too? Sometimes I think we need to appreciate this too, and that is that the principle of the tongue is really about communication. And some of the principles about restraint and about thinking equally apply to other areas of communication, like what I post on social media or other things. Sometimes I need to think before I do those kind of things, because by not exercising restraint in any form of communication can cause difficulty and can cause trouble. And sometimes we have to think, how is this going to be perceived? How is it going to be taken? How is this going to affect a reputation? And so think soberly. The righteous studies how to answer. Think about, why am I saying what I'm about to say? Why am I saying it? The widows that worried about being gossips, saying things which they ought not. Or Ephesians 4:29 that says, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth. Before I say it, I ask, why am I saying this? Am I saying it because I'm trying to get even? Am I saying it because I'm angry? Am I saying it to inflict pain? Am I saying it because I have somebody's welfare in mind? Why am I saying what I'm about to say? Furthermore, I need to ask, how am I going to say it? Am I speaking out of love? Am I speaking it out of grace? Now, all of us have said things that were taken in a way we didn't intend. I realize, because I speak every week, and I stand before an audience, and I don't have everything written down ahead of time as to what I'm going to say. And sometimes things come out in a way that's not always intended. There's a possibility of that happening when we use the tongue. But more than likely, when something comes out wrong, a lot of times it's because we didn't realize how it was coming across till we'd already said it. In other words, I need to ask myself the question, how am I going to say it? And is it the right time to say it? Proverbs chapter 15 and in verse 23. Proverbs 15 and in verse 23. Not everything has to be responded to. I think, and I meant to bring this out in the book of Job this morning, Job's friends felt compelled that they had to respond to everything that Job said. Not everything that somebody else says has to be responded to. Certainly there's errors sometimes that we have to respond to, but then there are other things that I don't always agree with. You know what? I can just let it go. And it's not necessary to stir up issues over that. I need to think, would I talk this way to Jesus? And before I say it to somebody else, if this was, would I talk to him that way? Would I use that tone? Or if Jesus was present, would I talk that way in front of him? I've had people come in before that have had marriage problems, and they'll talk about how he talks or she talks to the one another, and I think, I've never observed that before. And the reason is, while they'll talk that way to one another, they would never talk that way in front of other people, because that would destroy the facade they put up. And so here's the question I've got to ask myself, and that is, if I wouldn't talk that way in front of other people, would I talk that way in front of Jesus? Because guess what? Jesus is there. He sees everything that I say, every word of anger, every word that's meant to disparage and tear somebody else down. Jesus is well aware of that. And certainly when I'm trying to praise Jesus with that mouth, and then try to curse or do damage to somebody else, James 3 and verse 9 said that should not be. And so what do we do if we're going to learn to control the tongue? Well, I need to identify the specific area. I need to exercise restraint. I need to think before I speak. I need to address the heart of the issue. And what I mean by that is that the problem with the tongue is really sometimes a symptom of another problem. And I've illustrated this before. Sometimes among God's people, we're bad about addressing symptoms when we have to address problems. And what I mean by that, for example, somebody doesn't attend the way they need to, that problem is usually not a problem about Hebrews 10:25. There's a heart problem somewhere about where they appreciate the Lord and His sacrifice. When there's a problem with the tongue, oftentimes there is a heart issue because it's out of the abundance of the heart that the mouth speaks. And so that's where every sin originates. And so if I'm going to deal with that, I've got to deal with the heart of the issue. Let me illustrate just with one area. Suppose I'm struggling with angry words. I mean, I'm always lashing out. That's a problem with the tongue, but it's also a problem with anger, isn't it? And if I'm going to deal with that, probably I've got to learn to deal with the anger issue. Why am I getting angry over sometimes little things? You ever lashed out over something that then you think, that's just stupid? That wasn't all that important in the end. And so when I learn not to make mountains out of molehills and get irritated over every little thing, then I might find that I'm not speaking with the tongue quite as flippantly angry words as I used to. Why? Because I've dealt with the heart of the issue. See what, if I'm struggling, hopefully nobody here would, but if I'm struggling with slander, that is, I'm using my tongue to try to destroy my brethren, you've got a problem with brotherly love. You need to deal with the heart of the issue. When you deal with the heart of the issue, then the tongue will sort of fall into place. You understand what I'm saying? That there's oftentimes a deeper issue behind the tongue, and if the tongue is going to be controlled, we've got to learn to address the heart of the issue. Fifth, we need to remember we're going to be held accountable for our speech. James chapter 1 and verse 26, again, talks about if we bridle not our tongue, our religion is useless, and that we're going to give an account for every idle word. In other words, if when I speak, I think, you know what, someday I'm going to stand before God and I'm going to give an account of this. What I'm about to say and how I'm going to say it or who I'm going to say it about, it's going to be on my record in the end, unless I repent of some sin I've committed. Then that helps me to learn to control the tongue because I'm going to give an account for it someday. And finally, let me just say, pray and ask God for help. You ever prayed to God like David did? Guard my mouth. In the book of Psalm chapter 141 and verse 3, David said, set a guard over my mouth. Set a guard over my mouth, O Lord, and keep a watch over the door of my lips. I've got to learn to guard my own tongue, but I believe God can help me in that and give me the wisdom to do it. And Hebrews 4 and verse 16 said, in the time of need, I think particularly in the time of temptation, I go to the Lord and I ask for help in the time of need. And so if I'm struggling with my tongue, have you ever prayed to God, Lord, I realize I'm saying things I shouldn't say. I'm saying it in ways I shouldn't say it, or I'm saying it to people I shouldn't say it to. Lord, help me to put a guard on my tongue. Give me wisdom to say it in the right way. And I think the Bible tells us that when we do that, that God can help us in that battle with the tongue. And so the tongue, James chapter 3, James warned that it can be such a problem for so many of us. And yet the Bible doesn't just leave us hopeless, but it equips us, doesn't it, to do the battle that we need to do in order to tame the tongue. We're going to sing number 276, There is Power in the Blood. When we do, that'll be the proper time for one that needs to respond in obedience to the gospel of Jesus Christ. If you're not a Christian, you can become one this very morning by rendering obedience to the gospel and being buried in the waters of baptism. Or if there's somebody here that has obeyed but has wandered away from the Lord and needs to come back, you can make things right as well. No matter what your need is, do it right now as we stand and we sing.